Saint-Estèphe is the farthest north of the major appellations in the Medoc. It's located past Pauillac. It's the coolest of the major appellations, and it's generally the last to harvest. There tends to be a higher percentage of clay in the soils, and so there's a larger amount of Merlot planted in Saint-Estèphe than in appellations such as Pauillac. It's worth keeping in mind that clay soils tend to retain water a little bit better than gravelly soils, and so the wine producers in Saint-Estèphe typically fare well in very warm vintages, and so you can have some extremely strong wines in vintages like 2003 and 2009. Saint-Estèphe has two producers that are classified as second growths in the 1855 classification of Bordeaux, Cos d'Estournel and Montrose. Each of them are widely considered to be super seconds. Cos d'Estournel is a historic estate that was founded by Louis Gaspard d'Estournel back in 1811. Louis Gaspard was known as the Maharaja of Saint-Estèphe because he traveled the world to sell his wines, and he had a particular fascination with India. This fascination with India served as the inspiration for the architecture of the chateau, the landscaping of the gardens, as well as the interior decorating for the chateau. This is definitely a very unique estate, and certainly one well worth visiting if you find yourself in Bordeaux. Cos d'Estournel has exceptional terroir. While it's located in Saint-Estèphe, it's right on the Pauillac border and extremely close to Chateau Lafite. Cos means hill of pebbles, and Cos d'Estournel is aptly named because the vineyard that's located right on the chateau is very much on a rocky hill. Cos d'Estournel is also located close to the ocean, and so it tends to be a little bit cooler here, and Cos d'Estournel is definitely one of the last producers in the Medoc to harvest each year. They have around 100 hectares of vineyards, and the vineyards are planted to 56% Cabernet Sauvignon, 40% Merlot, 4% Cabernet Franc, and 1% Petit Verdot. While the vines average around 40 years of age, they do have some very special Merlot vines that average almost 100 years of age. Cos d'Estournel finished a massive overhaul of its winemaking facilities in the early 2000s. It's had a remarkable string of high-quality vintages ever since. Cos d'Estournel was very much a trendsetter when it comes to winemaking techniques that are becoming all the rage in Bordeaux today. For example, it was one of the first producers to use gravity flow rather than pumps to move the wine in the winery. As mentioned earlier, this results in wines that have less grippy tannins, and it leads to more elegance in the wines. In addition, Cos d'Estournel was one of the very first producers to use plot-by-plot vinification, which allows them to use much more precision when they're blending their wines. Compared to some other top producers in Bordeaux, Cos d'Estournel also is fairly restrained when it comes to new French oak to mature its wines. Specifically, with respect to the top wine, it typically uses only about 50 to 60% new French oak, and it matures the top wine for around 18 months or so. The Cos d'Estournel top wine is typically a blend that consists of around 2/3 Cabernet Sauvignon and 1/3 Merlot, although oftentimes there can be a splash of both Cabernet Franc and Petit Verdot. For example, in 2023, there's 1% of each. Cos d'Estournel has been firing on all cylinders for the better part of 2 decades, so it's really easy to find a number of extremely enjoyable vintages. 2002, for example, was definitely a candidate for wine of the vintage, despite the fact that it's not a generally strong vintage in Bordeaux. I've enjoyed that wine many times, and I'm very glad that I bought about 6 of them 10 years ago or so. 2003 was also an extremely strong vintage for Cos d'Estournel. Perhaps the best vintages of Cos d'Estournel ever made were 2009 and 2016, both of which received 100-point scores. And in general, you really can't go wrong with any of the vintages from 2014 to the present. I tasted the 2012 vintage at the winery a couple weeks ago, and that was even extremely enjoyable. It's almost near its peak, but probably needs another couple years or so before it gets there. I will warn you, however, that Cos d'Estournel is a wine that ages extremely slowly, and it takes it a number of years before it reaches its peak. In strong vintages, I'd recommend waiting at least 20 years before you start digging in. And as mentioned, even vintages like 2012 need probably 15 years or so before they reach their peak. The price for Cos d'Estournel's top line can vary wildly. With respect to the 2022 vintage, for example, I saw that one selling for anywhere from between $240 per bottle to well over $300 per bottle. So definitely make sure you shop around for that one. If you're wondering about a comparison between Montrose and Cos d'Estournel, I tend to find Cos d'Estournel to be a little bit more ripe and also to include some flavors and aromas of exotic spices, whereas Montrose can be a little bit more powerful, dense, and structured. If you're interested in wine recommendations, wine collecting strategies, and learning more about wine, please do subscribe to my channel. I've been collecting wine for more than 15 years and also have a level 4 diploma from the WSET. So I have both formal certification as well as substantial practical knowledge from the School of Hard Knocks. Cos d'Estournel also has an excellent second wine that's called Pagodes de Cos. This is a wine that was first produced in 1994. Pagodes is typically made with fruit from some of the younger vines on the vineyard that's located right by the chateau, as well as some fruit from the Maasbouzet vineyard. This is wine that typically matures in 40% New French oak. It oftentimes has a higher percentage of Merlot than the top wine. For example, the 2023 vintage is 51% Cabernet Sauvignon, 45% Merlot, and then there's 2% each of Cabernet Franc and Petit Verdot. This can be an excellent wine in its own right, and some of my favorite vintages for Pagodes de Cos include 2009, 2010, 2016, 2019, and 2022. The price for this wine will typically vary by vintage, and definitely shop around for it. But for example, I saw the 2022 vintage selling for around $65 per bottle, and the 2021 sells for quite a bit less than that. I saw it for as little as $40 per bottle. Cos d'Estournel also has a third red wine that's called G d'Estournel. This is a wine that's made with fruit that's from a vineyard that's located in the Medoc north of Saint-Estèphe. This is a wine that's designed for early consumption. It's a fruity wine that doesn't have the tannic structure of either the top wine or the Pagodes, so there's no need to cellar this wine at all. You can just enjoy it immediately. It sells for around $35 per bottle in the United States. I tasted the 2020 vintage when I was at the winery a few weeks ago and enjoyed it. To give you an example of the blend, the 2023 vintage consists of 2/3 Merlot, 1/4 Cabernet Sauvignon, and there's smaller amounts of Cabernet Franc and Petit Verdot. Since 2005, Cos d'Estournel has also made small amounts of a white wine that's called Cos d'Estournel Blanc. They produce about 200 cases of this wine annually, and it sells for around $160 per bottle. This wine is typically dominant in Sauvignon Blanc, but also includes a decent percentage of Semillon. When they're making Cos d'Estournel Blanc, they ferment in barrel, they suppress malolactic fermentation, and they mature it in 1 to 2 year old neutral oak barrels. The fruit that does not make it into the Cos d'Estournel Blanc typically will go into the second white wine, which is called Pagodes de Cos Blanc. This wine typically has a slightly higher percentage of Sauvignon Blanc, and it sells for around $50 to $60 per bottle on current release. If you enjoyed this video, I've published dozens of other videos about Bordeaux. If you'd like to learn more, please be sure to check out the playlist that's linked above.